the Ani, she goes by, which is sort of a name for a female Tibetan Buddhist Lama living in that cave. She had a shaved head. She wore the usual kind of saffron and yellow of the colors that the lamas and monks often wear. And it was funny because I interacted with her on a very everyday level. She was coming to get her blood pressure and her sugar checked at the clinic because that's the nearest clinic. And whenever there's a doctor there, which is twice a year, servicing foreign trekkers as well as locals, she comes to visit and gets all her medical checks. So it was very everyday, even though I.
Reisman, how are you?
Ethan, how are you? I'm good, thank you.
Doing well. Thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. How are you doing today?
Good. Doing
Good.
good. Staying at home, not working.
Hey, that's always a nice way to go.
Yes, I always say I'm getting to-dos to done.
There you go. Well, I appreciate you putting this on your to-do list.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad we found the time.
I recently finished your book, The Unseen Body, and that's kind of what captivated me to some of your YouTube discussions. And what really gripped me about your narrative prose and your style was the ability to interweave the analogies that you were able to kind of explicate for all of these unseen organs that we kind of a lot of times overlook. And so, like your explication on the heart specifically, the way that you compare it to a watershed and the tributaries and the estuaries of of geographical landforms. And so I guess I'll start kind of with that notion, the idea of the heart, which is kind of a often overlooked organ when the brain seems to take the cake on the most talked about organ when it comes to mind and consciousness. And so I like the way that you were able to kind of analogously weave into the style of the heart, how it relates to the geographical landforms. And I was going to see maybe if you could explicate that a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I think, the book in general sort of brings together a lot of the things that have fascinated me over the years. In medicine, once I started learning about the human body, certainly that fascinated me. But before I went to medical school, I was particularly fascinated with, as the book explains, the natural world and different cultures throughout the world. And for instance, the learning about watersheds and mountains and how you travel through the roadless mountains, which I learned a lot when I was in Kamchatka. That story comes from when I was 22. I was in Kamchatka for 4 months. Didn't speak English for about 2 months in a row, except for a few words. So I was really immersed in the local culture. That was probably the most eye-opening travel I've ever had in my life and probably will ever have in my life. I'm always striving after that first hit, that first high. But learning about watersheds and how you travel and how you find the paths that will let you go through into the next valley, that was very eye-opening for me coming from kind of a highway crisscrossed part of the world, which Kamchatka is not. But so those sorts of things fascinated me before I came to medical school. And then when I got to medical school and learned at the body, I just noticed all of these connections, like, as you say, understanding how blood vessels branch, how arteries branch with oxygen-rich blood to bring oxygen-rich blood to the cells, how they branch kind of to infinity, and then how the whole system coalesces back again from an infinite number of, not infinite, but, a high number of capillaries, microscopic little tubes that blood cells are going through almost one at a time because they're so small. And then coalescing back through the veins from, a trillion capillaries down to the large single rivers, if you will, that flow into the heart, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So, the map is the same. You're reading how to travel through the mountains or to navigate the cardiovascular system to understand its health and maybe problems that are there in it. If someone's having a heart attack or a stroke caused by a blood clot, or a blood clot to the leg, to the gut, to any organ, blood clots fly all around us and block branches of arteries to our spleen, to our kidneys. You can have that kind of, like, a heart attack's the most common, but you can have any kind of, quote, attack. We would call it an infarct. Death of the tissue by lack of oxygen, but you can have a splenic infarct, a renal infarct, any infarct. So a blockage within the branching watershed of the blood vessels is often the kind of a problem that the doctor has to investigate and solve. And I like that. Yeah, the connection with the waterways. The difference, as you suggest, the heart is so central. So on the earth, rain falls, and then a million little rivulets all gather together into one large river that eventually goes to the sea, and the process repeats. In the blood, everything starts in the heart, branches off to infinity to feed the trillions of cells in our bodies, and then branches back from infinity into the right atrium of the heart, almost coming back together. So the heart is sort of circular, unlike the more circular than the hydrological system of water on the earth.
Yeah, I see. And the analogy that you use for the circular nature of the heart is one that's utilized in a lot of spiritual traditions, which is the Ouroboros, the snake consuming itself. And I like how at the end you kind of brought that together to say the heart's like the internal human representation of the Ouroboros kind of manifest. And that's an interesting comparison because of how the heart's basically its own internal circular loop, as you just described.
Right. And there's actually another loop within the heart. When I referred to Ouroboros in the book, the heart's job is to pump blood, push blood, create blood pressure, and deliver a flow of blood with oxygen and other nutrients going to every cell, including itself. So the heart has to pump blood into the aorta to feed everything, and branching off that aorta. In fact, the first branches go to the heart itself. There's the left coronary and the right coronary arteries. So the heart is feeding itself in a way. And so the heart's the heart itself is a beneficiary of the heart's primary function. So it pushes blood to everything and itself, which is sort of like, I couldn't think of another example where an internal organ, its function serves, it is the target of its own function, as I say in the book, except when maybe the brain thinks about, how consciousness happens or how the brain works. That is the brain thinking about itself.
Yeah, and that philosophically, it always, whenever you're trying to get to the crux of the hard problem of consciousness or subjectivity, it always arrives at some irreducible loop, it seems like. Like a book I read recently kind of talks about the strange loop of the notion of I and the self. And it kind of makes me think about that philosophically. It's like the irreducible nature of a lot of things gets down to a loop whenever you try to prove things axiomatically in philosophy. And so extending on from the notion of your heart anecdote, the mind, of course, also is a hard problem to solve for a lot of philosophers. You touch on, of course, your experience in Nepal in the book, which is the most intriguing part for me because I'm so interested in the spiritual traditions that come from that area, especially Kathmandu, where you were at. And so it was interesting to read your encounter with a person who lived in a cave, even for for 30 years. And I kind of wanted to ask you what you learned about the mind and the brain as far as their interplay is concerned through that experience.
Sure. So I did work in a high altitude clinic in Nepal, specifically in the town of Manang. And while I was there, as you say, I met a number of characters. I met a lot of foreigners who were coming through hiking on the Annapurna circuit, and sometimes were getting sick and needing assistance. Other times, most often not. And as well as treating the local people in the town there, the locals who are from that area and others who come to get in on the thriving industry of foreigners wanting to walk for several weeks through the mountains and passing right through this town and buying lots of things. So it was really great. High altitude medicine, or kind of what happens to the human body when we go to high altitude, is really fascinating. Really kind of a small niche of medicine, something you sort of glance over in medical school, but don't explore in much depth. It's also very poorly understood. It's really like this mysterious realm where, we're still as mystified by it in a way as the probably ancients were, who would go up into the mountains and get sick and wonder what the heck is going on. And maybe some god doesn't want them to go in those mountains because of the way they feel. So I think, the body responds in particular ways. Our brains swell, our lungs can fill with fluid, or we just feel like crap, have no appetite, have a headache, dizzy, don't sleep well. That's kind of typical acute mountain sickness. While I was there, I did explore kind of the local culture, the local religion. There's a lot of lamas and lamaseries and in that area, and a lot of pilgrimage sites as well. And I really liked how sort of comparing, going high in the mountains to sort of going high in the mind to the higher strata beyond the brainstem, which is sort of more of a robotic control of the human body, without much, it's not very sensational for us to think about brainstem function, more like a calculator without a personality. But then as you get into kind of the emotional centers of the brain, and then even higher into where we think, consciousness sort of flows from. And I think one of the big lessons actually from neuroscience is that all those levels are very integrated very well. Everything we do on a daily basis almost weaves together very high analytical function of the brain, together with emotion and together with the more robotic neurologic control of the human body. It's not just when we sit back and think, we're all up in up in the most complicated sort of cells of the cerebral cortex. You kind of are weaving them all together all the time into this, what seems like a very unified fabric, but of course is sort of a million different little parts of the brain contributing to the whole. It was interesting to talk to that lady, the Ani, she goes by, which is sort of a name for a female Tibetan Buddhist Lama living in that cave. She had a shaved head. She wore the usual kind of saffron and yellow of the colors that the lamas and monks often wear. And it was funny because I interacted with her on a very everyday level. She was coming to get her blood pressure and her sugar checked at the clinic because that's the nearest clinic. And, whenever there's a doctor there, which is twice a year, servicing foreign trekkers as well as locals, she comes to visit and gets all her medical checks. So it was very everyday, even though I sort of tried to engage her on a deeper conversation. But she actually didn't want to talk too much about it. She sort of told me, go meditate and you'll figure it out.
Yeah, no, that's kind of seemingly typical of a lot of the Buddhist lamas and stuff. It's a tradition they don't disclose too often, I don't think. But that is a really fascinating encounter, however, to encounter a lama in that context, since your diverse realm of work brought you to Nepal, and that encounter is one of rarity for most of us. And so it is a neat, some personal, phenomenal experience, I assume. Just generally, it's you hear about that kind of meditator or lama, and it's rare to encounter them. So that's a neat anecdote that you weave into there. And just there, you mentioned, I guess this is a good point to ask you about, because I was kind of curious. Whenever you talk about skin and you talk about the importance of the layering and how the layering of skin, I'm just kind of brushing over this to get back to the brain, but the brain has a similar hierarchical structure as you just kind of described. And you mentioned the creation, or maybe the amalgamation of all of that phenomena occurring in the cerebral cortex can potentially is seen maybe to generate consciousness or generate mind. Do you see it as such? Or is that kind of where you see the mind and brain coming together? Do you think that it's high level cortical functioning that produces subjectivity, or do you have more of a philosophy on that that's not so physicalist? And I was just curious on that based on your experience.
Sure. I guess, my own opinion is, that I think the mind is maybe more impressive when you're living in it than it is from the outside, or we maybe see it as the pinnacle of the universe when actually the brain, it's complicated, of course, more complicated than any other organ, but I sort of wonder if it's overblown, the mind a bit. I think obviously animals have some part of mind, a lot of them do. And so I feel like mind is a gradient from perhaps complete automaton to what, ourselves, we think we're at the pinnacle of kind of mind. But I do think so much of what we call our mind or our awareness or our subjective experience is just this stitched together of the different brain parts. I feel the chair under me. I wasn't really paying attention to it, but now that I think about it, I feel the chair under me, the floor on my feet, and all that's going to the sensory cortex, at the front of the parietal lobe on each side of my brain. And that's just one little piece. And then I'm looking at you, I'm hearing myself, I see things in my peripheral vision. I think it's take a million different experiences. I'm maybe remembering a little at the same time. I'm feeling these gas gurgling through my intestines. I feel like there's a million things get stitched together into now and to what you experience as now. And just it feels like this. It feels like a mind, but maybe it's just 1,000 little things put together, and it just feels that way, and it's actually not that special, I guess, is what I wonder.
No, that's a interesting take, just because you're right. Whenever I'm used to looking at philosophy of mind, and which is in consciousness, a lot of times it takes consciousness and almost redefines it into this enigmatic, hard problem, of course. And if you attack it from the angle of it being an enigma that's hard, instead of just a byproduct of an epiphenomenon, then you're almost already starting at an angle which needs justification. But if you look at the mind epiphenomenally, potentially, of these high level interactions, I see what you're saying, that maybe the mind is looked at as such an inordinate phenomena, but merely interconnecting, interacting parts and systems inevitably induce experience, potentially.
Right. It's like a epiphenomenal aspect of having these 1,000 things go on in your brain at the same time, is like you experience it basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's kind of what, oh, sorry about that. That the layering, like you described, the hindbrain or the brain stem specifically, it's kind of, what would I say? I guess, scaffolded onto that is the higher level cortex you were mentioning. And the autonomous control of our involuntary breathing and things like that come and originate in the hindbrain, and everything else is kind of scaffolded on top of that to create this experience. And so, but the inner workings, of course, besides the brain, like you're saying, the brain, I'm thinking too that you mentioned in the book too, kind of your work, not going too far off of this subject, but the work you did with the intestines and how much the intestines can relay to a physician about the status of somebody's basically composition at the time and their internal states, and how important that analysis of the feces and all of that actually is to the overall diagnostic work. And to me, I've also heard a lot of commingling of that with the idea of the gut-brain axis, and how the gut and the brain and that interact to form a sense of mind. And so I kind of wanted to ask you on your work in that area, do you see the interaction of that between the gut and the mind and the brain pretty phenomenally as such, or do you see it more as just a cause and effect type issue?
They're definitely very intertwined in many ways. The gut, in a way, has its own nervous system, and even if severed from your spinal cord, it still can function to some extent on its own, which is pretty amazing. But the brain and the brain stem do have a little bit of higher level control to sort of nudge it in one way or the other and just impact its function.
Yeah.
But it's funny, the way in everyday medical practice, you see a lot of how the gut and the mind are intertwined, because people especially with intestinal disease, or sometimes without intestinal disease, they think about their intestines a lot and worry about them often. And it can play into anxiety a lot. And there are conditions like IBS where there's some role of kind of mental health plays some role in there. It's just a very poorly understood disease, and it's probably 10 different diseases, but we can't really tell that yet. But in that way, a person's sort of mental function, their brain function, higher level emotional worry, ruminating, wherever that happens in the brain, is very connected to what's going on in their intestines. And so there can be sort of loops, self-fulfilling or kind of positive feedback loops that can, cause trouble between the gut and the mind. There are some, there's a lot more. The gut, as I said, it's sort of its own world, right? It has its own nervous system in a way. And then it also has its own, ecosystem. I mean, there's billions of things that are not us in there, and they're playing a huge role in how our gut functions and how probably the rest of our body functions. And so I've seen even it proposed that, stool transplant therapy or restoring a proper mix of bacteria in your colon could even be a treatment for mental disease. I think that's still in the very early stages, but it is, fecal transplants is sort of the latest, maybe it cures everything treatment, which comes along in medicine kind of every few years. And then we do a bunch of studies and find out, it actually does help in a few conditions, but it doesn't cure everything as we sort of initially hoped.
Yeah, that's understandable. And that the microbiome, as it's called, that you described there, the diverse ecosystem, essentially, it's basically its own inner working ecosystem of bacteria that kind of like the analogy of the mycorrhizae on fungi that interconnects trees and things like that. It's like this mutualistic positive net gain for both organisms, essentially, to utilize this microbiome. And when that gets out of contortion with what it should be, or if that gets conflated, something goes wrong with the microbiome, and something gets off kilter, it's such a major issue, it seems like, in the diagnostics of like IBS and things like that, and Crohn's disease and all that. It seems like gut diseases just seem to be, just from people I've known and things like that, they seem to be hard to diagnose for a lot of doctors, or just they're so enigmatic in how they present, like you said. And so it was interesting to see your kind of how you explicated the essential matter of using all you can use, which is bodily fluids and stuff, to kind of get a measure on these things, and to make a diagnosis from that is kind of an incredible phenomena for someone who's not a medical doctor to really get to see into the difficulty of what you guys really have at your disposal sometimes to diagnose from.
Yeah, it's really interesting. As I say in the book, all of our bodily fluids are the craft, or are the medium of a physician's craft. So we have to, we learn about all the bodily fluids, some that flow within the body and some that flow outward from the body. So urine, stool, saliva that you spit out, sputum that you cough up, nasal drainage, vaginal discharge, every orifice of the human body offers some medium for a physician to work their craft on, which often means interpreting its signs. A weatherman looks at the sky and perhaps can interpret the clouds and the wind direction, and I look at someone's stool, or more often have them describe it to me, and it helps me figure out what might be going on. And there's 1,000,001 questions that I almost ask robotically at this point. It's part of my everyday job. When someone has diarrhea, I have this almost robotic algorithm in my head that flips on. How many times are you going a day? Is there blood in it? Mucus? Have you traveled recently? Do you have any other people around you who are sick? Did you eat any unusual foods lately? Is there belly pain, vomiting? Is it just soft stool, or is it completely water? Does it seem oily, float on top of the water, not flush easily? Is this different than your baseline? It's sort of like I don't even have to think to rattle off. And every bodily fluid, everything that flows out from the human body, have a similar set of questions. And then sort of based on that and based on what I see, if let's say they're coughing something up and I wonder if it's pneumonia, and listening to their lungs and listening to their heart, maybe getting a chest x-ray, it's all ties into sort of the initial analysis of these bodily fluids that flow out of a patient. So I like to think a little bit more deeply about the bodily fluids sometimes, which is, why in my book I try to connect things as you've been talking about. But they're fascinating, all our bodily fluids. Like even tears. I mean, we don't really analyze tears much, but it is something that flows out of the human body and contains information about us and electrolytes and whether things are in a healthy state or not. And even beyond that, one more point is that the blockage of fluid is responsible for a huge part of all diseases that afflict the human body. We talked about before, kind of blood clots or blockages of a branch of the arterial tree, but even every fluid in us can get blocked up. From, a gallstone can block up the flow of bile and cause severe pain or even kill you. A kidney stone can block up the flow of urine. A salivary stone can actually block up the flow of saliva. Those cause tremendous pain. Never had one myself, but I've seen people with them. Doesn't look fun. A little concretion in your ear, in your balance center, can get caught and stop the flow of that fluid in there that helps you figure out your balance and orientation. We call that benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. BPPV is when there's a little stone in there blocking up the fluid in your inner ear. So it's most of disease. Constipation is just a blockage in flow. Appendicitis and cholecystitis and diverticulitis is just a blockage in flow. And I kind of like that, how, I've heard peripherally about the Chinese medicine system, and they talk a lot about qi and flow. And it's kind of like in Western medicine, it's sort of also all about flow of these fluids and how they get blocked up. And so, which means a lot of what we do as doctors is basically plumbing.
Yeah, no, the analogies that you draw on kind of assemble the human organism into this unseen, engine of sorts, which is really crafty the way that your prose intertwines your anecdotes with it, because the analogies kind of really help the person who's not a medical doctor, which is what I'm sure was your intent, but non-medical doctors. A lot of times I don't think about the human body in terms of fluid, and also don't even think about 10 of those 12 fluids that we have in our bodies to begin with. And so I think bringing like attention to things like mucus and sputum and things like that, as awkward as that may sound, or that discourse may be, I mean, it really does help at least see what we're dealing with. The human organism is consistently recycling itself, and fluids are continually in and out, and the importance of those flow is critical. Just like in your book, you also highlighted something interesting, was modern medicine not really realizing the impact of clotting back in history of medicine. It was like this advent that came on the scene where somebody was like, hey, maybe there's clots in blood. And that kind of revolutionized the axis of medical science. And so I was going to ask you kind of about that. That's kind of that was an advent, I think you kind of presented as in medicine, and how that impacted diagnostics, do you think, and kind of just the evolution of medicine in that way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Something I've been fascinated with since I ever learned about it early in medical school. But basically, this realization or advent that you're talking about is the foundation of all of modern medicine. For centuries and millennia, I'm sure some very smart doctors figured out sort of what was going on in some diseases. But the idea that prevailed in the minds of doctors, basically, from ancient Greece through the Middle Ages, et cetera. And, the way doctors think disease happens impacts the way they then diagnose it and treat it. And so for most of the last few millennia, we ascribed to this humoral theory, which was that there were four main humors that sort of flowed or swirled in some sort of quasi-spiritual way through the body. It was a very philosophical approach to the body. It was Aristotelian. He had sort of along the lines of the four elements that make up the universe. The human body has these four humors, and they must be kept in balance. And disease, pain, symptoms, death must result when these humors get out of balance. It's a philosophical approach to the body. It almost doesn't make sense when you're thinking about flesh and blood. But really, the huge change in how doctors understand disease, and therefore basically the foundation of modern medicine, came in really the mid-1800s, especially in Germany and Austria and parts of Central Europe, where pathologists basically started doing autopsies. So autopsy is the foundation of modern medicine. Once people actually started opening up the dead to figure out what happened, it obviously, not surprisingly, showed them what was going on inside the body. Before that, there was a lot of reasons they didn't. There was a lot of restrictions on how you handle the dead in different religious and cultural traditions. It also wasn't, I don't think they thought it would be that useful, amazingly, which just shows how wrong based their idea of disease and health was. And once they started cutting open the body, there's some famous pathologists. They invented pathology, basically, the study of disease. Rudolf Virchow, I think from Germany, and Karl Rokitansky from Austria. They did hundreds and hundreds of autopsies and figured out that disease is not this swirling, imbalanced philosophical condition for philosophers to debate in a lecture hall, but it's actually something you can point a finger at. So there's actually a tumor there. There's an abscess. There's an aneurysm that burst. There's a blood clot blocking flow. It's there, and you can point to it, right? Autopsy, the word means to see for yourself. And that's what they were seeing for themselves by cutting open bodies. And so from that point, we started understanding things completely differently. I mean, it's taken centuries to develop our understanding of each disease. But, leeches, for instance, which were a treatment for rebalancing these imbalanced humors, stayed a popular therapy into the early 20th century. So it takes time for diseases in medicine to sort of filter around, even good ideas like washing your hands after doing an autopsy and before you go deliver babies, which took about a century after it was realized for doctors to actually jump on the hand washing bandwagon. But so understanding that disease has a seat. One of the original manuscripts by, I think it was a French doctor who was doing autopsies, was sort of on the seat of disease. Disease has a seat inside the body. It's not this swirling, magical, Aristotelian philosophical problem. You can point to it, and when you can point to it, you can figure out how to fix it. And since in the last 250 years, since almost 200 years, perhaps, we have figured out quite a lot. It's pretty great, and we're going to figure out a lot more, I'm sure, in the decades to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's such an incredibly interesting tidbit of it, or not even really a tidbit, but just a facet of medical science history that you highlighted there. And that's why, yeah, I wanted to ask about it specifically, was just because the transition from bloodletting to a more physicalist framework, by which it seems to me almost philosophical in its trending in thought, because it moved from this quasi spiritual, as you say, to a physical one. Like there's an actual correlate to disease. Disease has a pinpoint place in the body, and it kind of, with consciousness as a subject matter, it's often studied by looking at correlates between movement and the brain region that's associated with that movement, and hopefully, as the medical science gravitates towards that further, that eventually unpacking this closer to correlates between conscious behavior and conscious mind and brain region will deliver potentially an answer to, well, how do ions just diffusing across membranes lead to pleasure, pain, things like that, which, yeah, in mind, like you said, I think it's probably more of an epiphenomenal issue, but sometimes it is odd to think about it at its core, where you've got ion transfer of sodium, potassium, and others going through neural pathways. As complex as those pathways are, they're still just ion transfer. So and fluids, as you say. So it's hard to imagine, where did that ion transfer get its subjectivity from? But that's a whole debate, I suppose, amongst philosophers. So it's kind of a can of worms.
Right. Though I wonder if, going from the humoral explanation for disease, which has this very complex, enigmatic, it's this enigmatic concept that it's kind of hard to understand concretely, more philosophical than sort of, material. I sort of wonder if, and then to figure out like, oh, these people are just dying because there's a kidney stone blocking their urine, like, duh. And then the bacteria crawled up and made them septic and they died. So I wonder if consciousness will have a similar explanation that's less grand and just sort of like, oh, yeah, duh. Like it's just a relatively simple mechanism, and not this sort of magical, coolest thing in the universe. I mean, it's pretty awesome. Don't get me wrong. I love consciousness, but I think we are, I don't know if I coined the term, but I created a term, anthropopsychocentric, where you think the human mind is the greatest thing in the world. And again, it's great, but I sort of wonder if we're biased in that assessment.
Oh, no, I agree. As I've, from being from a non-academic background, completely just studying this, just a routine, just on my own and whatnot, it's been an interesting transition to go from this. I never really understood how I philosophically viewed the world. Materialism versus physicalism never really struck me as odd. I never saw consciousness as a problem. And then all of a sudden I had this insightful revelation to myself about, well, I mean, I understood particle physics to the degree that a high school graduate would. But I also understood it to be like, well, at some point this material rearranged itself. The same material somehow rearranged itself from non-living matter to organically living matter to something like a human. And that phenomenon in itself just became a little bit incredulous to me, because I was like, it just seems, so much chaos and entropy that then you see something like a force of selection. So that's what I was moving into, is kind of your, like you explained, there's layered aspects to the human body, and I think maybe even to the evolutionary phylogenetic tree of life potentially. And I wanted, since you are, since you say, and since obviously by your travels and everything, you're a naturalist at heart, I would assume, just like Darwin, someone like Charles Darwin did similar things with exploration and going places. And so I find a lot of parallels probably between you and the mind of Darwin. And so I kind of wanted to ask you about him and what your thoughts are on evolution by natural selection, and how you see that.
Like, if do I think it is the story?
Oh, no, I'm not. Honestly, I don't think there's a place in science really to decline it. I mean, I'm scientist, so I'm trying not to ask you, do you believe in evolution? More so, I'm asking, how do you see its beauty as because I see it as another aspect of beauty to this entire layered structure that you put together in your book, and between the organs to the cells, and then extra symbiotically, kind of between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, you've got this unique play of cyclical, like you said, the water cycle earlier, but then you've got the oxygen to carbon cycle between. So I see like a further higher level view of the analogies you create between that phenomena of evolution.
Yeah, I think evolution, well, evolution is great, I think, first of all. I mean, I think it created our bodies, or our bodies were the reason they are the way they are is can be accurately explained through evolution. And I like pontificating and imagining, reasons for things. Though I do think it's sort of fun. Like we can't ask why. I mean, we do all the time. We ask, why is the body shaped the way it is? Why do men's prostate grow when they get older? It causes a lot of problems. Like, what's the deal with that stupid organ? We ask why a lot, and we can only hypothesize at why. Oh, we have, obviously we have vision to help us eat, to help us get food, find food, prepare it, eat it. We have hands for the same reason, but sort of why evolution is hard to answer about why. We can only hypothesize and never know for real unless we run another experiment over 2 billion years. But I do think that people sometimes ask me, like, what's the weirdest body part? And I often say, there really is no weird part. They every body part and every aspect of the way we're shaped is a completely rational, everyday solution to a problem. And everything sort of makes sense through that lens. Why is the pancreas there? Why is the gallbladder there? Like, oh, the pancreas makes these enzymes that need to help break down the food. And why is bile there? Well, bile is actually a crucial molecule that holds water-soluble enzymes to break down fat on one side and the fat itself on the other side. Otherwise, water-soluble enzymes could never get to fat. So bile holds the two water-soluble fat molecules together. It makes perfect sense. I do think evolution is the reason we have all this, because it works. And I think the problem-solving rationality of evolution is sort of the same problem-solving rationality that we use every day of our lives to solve problems. And I think evolution is so amazing when you think about it, because it is intelligent in the same way that we are. We have a problem. We make a material solution, like, oh, if I tweak it this way, it'll flow better, because you understand how things flow and how things get slowed down, speed up. You just understand the world by sort of using your hands on it for some decades in life. And so you have this practical, everyday problem-solving ability. And evolution sort of does the same thing and comes up with great solutions that we can appreciate. So I feel like that's part of the reason that we appreciate it so much, and why I could see why people, even with all we know, believe in a creationism where there's some human-like figure that created us, because the way our body is intelligently shaped it's intelligent. We recognize that as intelligent. It's the same intelligence that we use to understand the world and solve problems. And so it looks human-like, that design. So I understand completely why someone would think a human-like, deity created it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And of course, like the bilateral symmetry and stuff, and the symmetries that seem to kind of permeate even down to the quantum level of physics are kind of not inexplicable, I don't want to say, but a beautiful aspect of the universe that's mimicked in human structure is the duality between our bilateral parts. And then you look out at nature and humanity and what it's created. So you look at a house and then a vehicle, and you still see that tendency to design everything by the mind of an architect is still trending towards symmetry in all of his endeavors. And so it's almost like there's this innate symmetrical longing that represents in human phenotypes, of course, and then phenotypes of animals, trees. And of course, to me, I think it's a potential just representation of the fractal nature of everything, where everything kind of so I don't think that it needs to be probably explained dogmatically or philosophically, but it is a neat, like you bring up, the same intelligence that we can comprehend the universe with. It's got to be the intelligence that created us. So it's a kind of incomprehensible how comprehensible some of the things about the universe really are.
Exactly. Yeah, I think also it just works. Symmetry works. Having something branch a lot works. Like if you want to get blood from one heart to 1 trillion cells, you need a branching system of tubes. It works. If you want to have information, stored on your computer, the branching system of folders is how you do it. That's like a universal property of the universe. And I think evolution figured out, oh, this is what works. And we, using that very similar intelligence, figure out, oh, the same thing works. Like you want to you want to set up a plumbing system for a building with 100 apartments. You need to get water from this one tank, or maybe we need 2 tanks, and then a branching system, and then that water under pressure is feeding all the sinks and shower heads and other faucets in every of those 100 apartments. Then it goes down the drain, and 500 different drains coalesce back together to enter the sewer system. And then you've just mimicked completely the cardiovascular system, with the arteries feeding fresh blood or fresh water and then draining back through the veins. And so it just works. And we figure out what we're good at, figuring out what works. And evolution is really good at figuring out what works, because if it doesn't work, you die. So it's a very good system for figuring out what works and then perpetuating that system.
Awesome. Yeah, I think so as well. I just figured, you look, as being a medical doctor, a lot of times you don't have to look into evolutionary biology all of the time, I wouldn't assume, but it just seemed like you're right. Yeah. It just seemed like your journeys and stuff mimicked a lot of the mind of what Darwin kind of had, where it was this seeking of these adventurous areas to help further medical and scientific understanding. And I think Darwin was such a brilliant mind. I mean, even at his time, it was, 200 something years ago, to be able to take small observations like the back of a tortoise shell or the beak of a finch and to piece together something as complex and beautiful as the tree of evolution, like he argues On the Origin of Species, without knowledge of genetics specifically, without knowledge of recessive and dominant traits and cellular cells, even to still be able to come up with that from such a small piece of sample of nature on his journey is a pretty neat thing that evolution came from. And so I guess that was my question. And to kind of build off of that, one of the odd things about evolution that is created is the notion of empathy that you mentioned as well, as you discovered empathy kind of even more intensely throughout your life as a doctor. You talk about treating your patients. Always, it seems like empathy comes first to you. You were several times worried about their pain levels over a lot of other things, worried about their sleeping being continuous. And so, which is excellent, which is nice to read that from a doctor being so intimately concerned with those things. Because a lot of times, sometimes it feels like we're separated from probably our medical practitioners because of the doctor-patient relationship not being as solidified maybe as it always has been or should be. And so it's cool to see, how much effort you put on to empathy for your patients. So I guess I wanted to ask you about empathy in medicine and what you've come to learn about its importance.
Empathy definitely is a huge part of medicine. Something we think about a lot. There's different questions. I guess, where did our empathy come from is one question that's harder to say. I mean, clearly we're a social animal that depends on division of labor, and whether between the sexes or between, communities. And I do firmly believe that our emotional and cognitive brain centers were formed in the context of, like 5 guys with spears hunting down a woolly mammoth, basically, and the problem solving that takes. But then also, even the anatomical knowledge of the men and women who then butchered those animals was fantastic. I always kind of admire that as well, how with perhaps one small sharp flake of stone, they knew, they could dismantle these humongous animals. They knew exactly where every joint was and how to cut through every tendon and ligament to dismember the animal. So I really love thinking about that knowledge. But empathy is, it's really important to show empathy with your patient. The interaction between a doctor and a patient, it seems very calculating and cold. And even the way I told you about the questions I'll ask when someone has diarrhea, it's sort of like, oh, if X plus Y and Z is the case with their diarrhea, then the diagnosis is computation, and here's the diagnosis. And there is that very mechanical, calculating, cold, no need for emotion there aspect of diagnosing. But of course, you're 2 humans dealing with each other, interacting with each other. And so necessarily there's this social aspect to it inherently. Maybe one day when AI takes my job, that won't happen anymore, and people will realize that they're smarter than humans, and I'll take the cold calculating thing with, I'll get my emotions elsewhere, basically. Just give me the right answer, which could be the case. But you're a human interacting with each other. And it's so, anyone who's been to a doctor, even doctors, it's such a bizarre experience. It's you're vulnerable. It's embarrassing. It's awkward. And it's so important. I think part of when someone says you're a good doctor or thanks you or seems happy with what you've done for them, I think a huge part of that is just that you're a human and you're being empathic, but you're also just interacting them like with a normal human. Too much eye contact is awkward. Too little eye contact is awkward. Too much touch is definitely awkward. Don't do it. No touch is also can be awkward. It's sort of, and then you're in this room with this other person who you never met before, and 5 seconds after introducing yourself, you're discussing the most intimate details of their life, things potentially they're not even talking to their spouse or loved one about, what their poop looks like. They see blood, the pains they're having, what's happening in the bathroom, what's happening in the bedroom, worries they're having. These are things that they are sort of vomiting out in front of you in this room, this person you just met, and have to ask, like, well, tell me about the color of your poop. Yeah. So it's a very bizarre human interaction. And as a result, I feel like you need to be not extra human, but you have to pay extra attention to how human you're being, to how empathetic you're being, and it's sort of this very weird person-to-person dance that's unlike any other context, I think, in which two people interact with each other. It's very bizarre at times, scary, very scary at times, sometimes for both patient and doctor. And so I think, empathy, but just dealing with being a human and dealing with another human is such a crucial part of medicine, perhaps the most crucial part. And there's also, I want to say, it's good to actually feel empathy, but as a doctor, if you don't actually feel it but fake it well, that's also good, because as long as the patient feels you're being empathetic, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. I mean, you should probably feel some empathy. You're a human. Yeah. But even if you don't, but can fake it well, that's also good. Like, because that patient needs to feel like there's a human talking to them, not just sort of this cold, calculating, non-eye contact making automaton.
Yeah, no, I would have to think that would be at least enacting the character of empathy would be at least preferential to completely hands-off, calculating, and cold, like you described there. And in your book, you kind of mentioned some doctors that you encountered that seem maybe to have been like that in certain ways, and it seemed like a lot of your efforts were to place the patient first, which I found intriguing from the first person standpoint of yourself, being able to see the intricate way in which you worried about your patients, the way in which you put in so much extra time studying, like the nature of leeches. When that came up, it seems like a lot of curiosity for you blossomed out of going into medicine, and I find that super unique. How you found avenues by which to pursue that curiosity, like immediately going and seeing the plastic surgeon to find out about the leeches, and having them put in extra things in the lab for you to go and look at it. Just those little episodic things that you capture seem like a cool curiosity that gripped you in medicine.
Yeah, and I was that way before medicine as well. And a lot of my friends, I think, marveled at my unquenchable thirst to just know how everything works, how everything is done, how everything works, taking apart everything, wanting to figure out how it functions on the inside. And so when I got to medicine, it was sort of more of that. And I was always sort of one to follow my nose and seize the opportunity for adventure. I first went traveling after college, and that just going off to the end of the earth and learning all I can and asking very silly questions to people with life experiences so different from my own. I just fell in love with that, and I just continued doing that as a doctor as well. And so I, in the same way, followed my nose. I got to medical school, was dissecting a cadaver, and then heard about the slaughterhouse that was a few miles away, and thought, I'm learning about all these muscles. Let me go learn about sort of those muscles, which are very similar, and a lot of the knowledge overlaps quite a bit. So, and then, just traveling around the world, getting interested in everything from how to butcher to how to identify wild edible mushrooms to how to brain tan hides in the traditional Native American way. All those things got tied together in my book. So my book is just a way of tying together all these disparate things that I've always been super curious about. And I'm still trying to follow my nose, always looking for that next adventure.
Yeah, no, I found it super elegant. I found it super unique to the way in which you coupled your anecdotal experiences so well with the medical discourse, everything. It really reads well for someone who has no medical background. And I like things that start off somewhere and end up somewhere completely different, but all of it comes together at the end to formulate the story that was trying to be told, like a callback to all the original things discussed in the prior chapters. And just the way that you weave the anecdotes with the actual unseen part of the body, is as the book's called, was super neat. And so coming across your book just struck me as fascinating. And I wanted to say that again, and I won't keep you too much longer. I just wanted to say that again and say thank you very much for coming and speaking with me about all these topics. I know it could go on for 6 hours, and maybe one day we can dig deeper into it. But I just I wanted to let you go, but I wanted to tell you once again how much I appreciated you taking the time today because of how much the book meant to me. It's really neat to get to hash some of that out with you.
I'm really glad we got the opportunity, and I'd love to chat again in the future.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it again, Dr. Reisman. We'll talk soon, and you take care.
All right. Take care, Ethan. Bye-bye.